I want to know the essentials. I want to be informed, but I also don't want to spend, hours upon hours, because everything you put out there, you have a responsibility for the energy you put into the world. And so if you put something into the world that fuels fear, anxiety, hate, that impacts people. And depending on your following. So I have become more intentional, more selective about curating my own feeds, if you will.
Podcast Junkies, episode 257. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you're new to the show, it's the one where we seek out interesting folks in podcasting and get them to kick back their heels and talk about life, their shows, their cats, whatever else is on their mind. Last week, roughly, we had a great conversation with Allison Williams and Darren Biddle of Newark Ventures and Audible, respectively. And something interesting we did last time, in case you missed it, is we had a follow-up conversation when that episode went live on Clubhouse, something I'm looking to do more of with future guests, past guests, coordinate, and do what I'm calling a postcast on Clubhouse. So if you're not connected, I'll make sure to provide the link to the Podcast Junkies room on Clubhouse in the show notes, as well as my profile as well. So make sure you click the link on both of those to follow me and also to be notified when we do have those postcasts. I'll also be bringing back some of the past guests into that format, so expect to hear some old and familiar voices. This week I speak to Kimi Culp. She's the host of All the Wiser. She's a TV and film producer, and she joins the show to talk about her background in journalism, intense stories she tells on her podcast, and her struggles with bipolar disorder. As host of All the Wiser, Kimi curates some of the most amazing stories you've ever heard, from dramatic stories of survival to unforgettable lessons on loss and love. And in this episode, we discuss her career in broadcast journalism, lessons she's learned from Diane, Sawyer, and Oprah Winfrey, the intimacy of podcasting and the importance of storytelling, and why everyone is hiding a little piece of themselves. Yes, including you. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/257. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed this episode or past episodes, I'd love it if you leave a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. One other thing I wanted to mention is, in the interest of continuing to build connections with you, my listener, and expanding our Podcast Junkies community, I'm testing out a new app called Bunches. The URL is pretty easy to remember. It's Bunches, like bunches of grapes, bunches.chat/Podcast Junkies, one word. We've already got about 16 folks in there that are new and have discovered the chat app. What I like about it is that it takes the conversation outside of Facebook. And for me, that's a good thing. I tend to spend less and less time in there, and it just becomes a big rabbit hole and not a productive use of my time. So I'm trying to pull the community together in an environment and in a space that's more conducive to having one-off conversations specifically for fans of the show. So check it out, bunches.chat/Podcast Junkies, and I'll also have that link in the show notes. Make sure you stay to the end of the conversation where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. Let's get a little bit wiser with Kimi. So Kimi Culp, host of All the Wiser, thank you for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm grateful to Shelby Stanger, who introduced us, who's a really awesome person. And sometimes just by virtue of introductions and you knowing the person making the introduction, it's almost like whoever you get introduced to by that connection, you can almost always trust it.
And Shelby knows everyone on the planet. There's no one she doesn't know. So I'm like, talking to her, and she's like, yeah, I can introduce you to President Obama. I mean, yeah, not a problem. And I'm like, who don't you know? And better yet, the people she knows are like categorically cool and people I would want to know too. So she's like never introducing you to like someone douchey.
I don't know how you feel about that, but having a network of friends whose opinions you trust and respect is really, really helpful, because it's almost like the pre-vetting is already done. And you just, by virtue of the introduction and the connection, you already know that it's going to be something meaningful.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm very grateful and have a huge amount of respect for her for not only knowing so many people because she's fabulous, but also connecting people, which is of real value because you never know what's going to come out of a connection. It could be a really meaningful, creation in the world. So cool.
How did you guys meet?
I'm friends with her sister.
Okay.
Yeah. So her sister is female entrepreneur here in LA, a badass in her own right. And I met through her sister. So yeah, they're both incredible people.
How do you think about cultivating friendships and how important is that to you?
I think it's incredibly important. I've always innately been a very social person. And I would describe myself as both an extrovert and introvert because I really need that human connection. And I also need, I think, time by myself. But it is, in my relationships, it is, I love to walk, I love to hike. And, when you're 2 hours on a hike with your girlfriend or, just walking with a cup of coffee, the conversations are real, right? It's different than sitting at the 40th cocktail birthday dinner, and they propel you. And I think holistically, like both professionally and personally, and to have somebody who knows and loves you, but can step outside, and say, so I think, friendships and connection and loving, supportive relationships are at the core what life is about. And that shows up in romantic relationships and familial relationships, but personal relationships for me are something that I deeply value.
I'm going to direct listeners to episode 10 of your podcast, which is the one where you told your story. You sort of had the tables turned and your producer, was it Erica that interviewed you on the podcast?
No, it was my friend Holly Gordon, who's a journalist. So she was the right person. That's her background.
Something you said in that interview was that you love being in love. What does that mean for you?
Well, I think we were talking about early on, and I just look like, those people who always have a boyfriend in high school and college.
Yeah.
Like, we all know those people, and I was that person, but it was always like so in love. Like, oh my gosh, this is just, like I'm listening to Sinead O'Connor and, lying on the bed staring at the ceiling. And I just think I experience the world deeply, and that includes love and first loves and, all that comes at the excitement of the beginning of new relationships. So yeah, I do think someone who loves to love deeply.
And I think that'll come into play as we dig in here further, as people learn about your background. But you went to school for journalism. So I'm wondering if you knew early on that that's a field that you were interested in, or, when people are young or kids are young, like, I want to be a fireman, I want to be an astronaut. Like, what was going through your mind at a young age as you were getting ready to figure out what you wanted to study?
Well, I was a C student, much to my parents' dismay. I definitely, in hindsight, had a learning disability, which I now understand. But I leaned into my core strengths, right? Because sometimes find our weaknesses, we compensate with our strengths, right? We lean into that and to go and gravitate towards the things that are natural, the things that we're good at. And I literally think it all started with one moment. And there was a project, it was probably around, the end of elementary school going into 6th grade. And you had to do really, pretty immersive research for that age and present and, turn in this written paper. And I was convinced that I was not going to do the paper. And I went to my teacher and I said, I would like to do my report using video and photography. And it was the time of Michael Jordan, the announcement that he was HIV positive. And at the time, that issue was so hot and so misunderstood and so everywhere. And I'm like, I want to do, which now I would call, I don't think I had the language to say a short form doc or, which probably was a poorly lit short-term doc. But I'm like, this is how I want to tell the story. I want to tell it through real people. I want to meet the people. I want to bring the people to life visually. And then I want to stand in front of the class and tell you about this issue through the people who are living it. And I had a teacher, luckily, who was like, okay, you're still going to have to give me the index cards with some actual writing. And I did it. And there was like a hospice center specifically with patients who were dying, which also was crazy because there was all this misconceptions about contagion, right? And you did wear a mask and all that. So I went and I interviewed these people, and I found a couple of other interviews, a woman who had been in a car accident in Brazil and had a blood transfusion. And I strung the videos together and I took pictures and I did my presentation. And I think at that point, I was just like, that's what I want to do. Like, that is my jam. Like, that was exciting. You know what I mean? I was totally immersed in telling that story and making it beautiful and making it impactful. And so I think I knew then that that was my lane.
Were you consuming anything or watching anything that inspired you? You know, I remember early on, my dad loved like 60 Minutes, and we'll get into some of the work you did later on, but just early, watching. So it was just fascinating to see. And now that I interview people, I look back and I'm like, well, I was probably influenced in some small way by watching like Barbara Walters or Mike Wallace, or just like having to sit through these at the time I thought were boring interviews, but just understanding like that's a skill set. So I'm just curious if there's anything you were listening to or watching that was inspiring you that you may not have realized that at the time.
I don't think I realized that. And that's a great question. My grandfather was the voice of Cleveland, and he, for 50 years, spun records very early in the morning, and in between would tell the news of the day and also just stories. And I remember going to visit, and some mornings I would get up early and I would sit on his lap and watch him with a microphone. And he was, like smoking 17 cigarettes during the broadcast with the 4-year-old on his lap. And so, I mean, like, that's an imprint, right? Like, there's got to be something there.
Oh, yeah.
And when I started the podcast, my mom found his microphone. It's like WCRP. And it looks like it should be in a museum. I mean, it looks completely inoperable, but like the coolest antique vintagey thing you've ever seen. So I believe in that. Like, it's genes.
Yeah, definitely.
Somewhere in there. So probably, I don't remember somebody who was famous, but I remember watching my grandfather and being intrigued enough by saying, can I get up and go with you?
Did you keep that mic?
Did I keep it?
Yeah. His microphone.
Yeah. Yeah, I have it. Like everyone else during COVID, I moved and my life is in a rental, or I would just pop it up right now and show you.
Yeah, that's for a podcast, so it feels like a collector's item.
Totally.
So out of college, you started working at NBC?
Yeah.
And I want listeners to listen specifically to episode 10, obviously to the whole podcast, and we'll have links to all of it. But I think you tell the story, some fascinating stories just in that episode of like your early days. So just without giving too much away, can you talk a little bit about your first assignment, if I remember correctly, was a pretty impactful one, and then how your career took off from there?
Yeah. So I started on the overnights, like fetching coffee and being verbally abused by television correspondents and anchors. It was so the deadlines. It was like, where's the facts? Give me the coffee. Like, wrong piece, But that said, some people who were so wise and awesome and wonderful, wonderful bosses. But so I started in the overnights, quickly became a researcher. At the time, it was Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. And I, oddly, was assigned to Bob Hager, who at the time was the most well-known aviation and transportation correspondent. And what that means is, unsexy as it sounds, is every time the big marquee would be a plane crash, Bob was first on the scene, ahead of all the reporting, on the phone with the NTSB and the FAA, but also just a lot of things. Like when there was massive controversy with Firestone tires and accidents all over, he was the investigative. So it was actually a more dynamic news beat than one would imagine. So it's 9/11. I'm the researcher for NBC for the top aviation correspondent. Not a relatively high-powered job. I'm young. And we get the news. We go into the newsroom. As you can imagine, the chaos, and in an organization that had very efficient systems of communication and a great responsibility, different than today, about the steps it takes to get factually backed by multiple sources information to the public. It was not as quick as it was. And that there was a whole process, right? And that is thrown out the window because our systems are crashing. We need to be informing the world. So, and every big correspondent has left the building, as they should, because they're going to Ground Zero, they're going to the Pentagon. I was in Washington at the time.
I was in New York.
Oh, you were? You were?
Yeah.
What were you doing in New York?
I lived in East Village. I used to work at downtown, like 3 blocks away from the World Trade Center. I would go there for lunch. And I just missed. So I would turn on my TV at 8:45 every morning to check the weather before getting on the subway, because it would take me 15 minutes to get to work. And I turned it on at 8:45, and the first one had already crashed. So I just ended up sitting there watching it and just watching everything happen real time. Outside my window, I could see the Twin Towers. So I would wake up every morning and you could see them in the distance.
The reminder.
And so I was watching the TV and I was staring at the window, watching TV. I remember doing that like almost 10 times because I was like, is this real? Like, is this, because I would see it on TV and then I would see it in the distance outside the window. And then at some point we ran up to the roof and the whole building was up there. Some person brought up a telescope. So it was definitely a wild day. So it's always interesting to hear like other people's experiences about what was happening. So yeah, definitely like continue.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry that you had to see that because I imagine it's something you'll never forget. And we do have all of our stories of that moment in time. You know, it's not probably unlike generations before when Kennedy was shot. You remember the exact moment.
Yeah.
But to have yours be so visual and up close. So yeah, so the newsroom erupts into chaos. There's normally some organization and system that goes into the reporting. And Tim Russert at the time was the bureau chief. And it was Tim and somebody else who, come out and they say, basically, if you have something to report that the nation needs to hear, immediately stand on your desk. Because there was no other way. Within the computer system, we did a thing called top line, which is when it's red, it needs to go to reporting. Everything was red, right? It was like, so somebody quickly came up with, we need a new system. We need it now. And it's going to be as archaic as we're going to trust the journalistic instincts in this room and stand on your desk. Obviously, there's a vetting process, right? They're going to ask some questions.
Yeah.
So I'm a researcher. Not really on the front lines of sharing information with millions and millions of people, not making those calls, assisting in them. And they put me on the call with the FAA, say, we need you to listen in. Bob is in the field. His producer is with it, kind of everybody. So I'm listening. I'm taking my notes. And there was a reporter at the time who was at the New York Times and another reporter at the Washington Post. And I knew from Bob that they were the guys. They were the print guys who got it, who had the same sources he did, who were always ahead of the game, who were cautious and judicious in what they reported. So I said, I'm going to hone into these guys. I'm going to listen deep to their questions. I'm going to really focus on their answers. And that will be my guiding post right now. And they asked a question. They said, we're implementing the first ever in history national ground stop. And everyone's like, great, what's a national ground stop? Because it had never been used. And this came from Matthew at the New York Times. And he said, every plane in this country will be grounded. They started to take the specifics. And I'm like, country needs to know this. So I stand on my desk, news erupted, and I just say, I have news that goes, like screaming, this must go to air, this must go to air. And everyone's like, what? And I'm like, there's a national ground stop. Same question. What is a national ground stop? And I'm looking at my paper. Sources confirmed from FAA spokesperson, there's a national, every plane within the next. And then you look and it's like Tim Russert looking in the eyes of 15 million Americans saying that it's going to air. Right? And that was a completely defining moment, right? That all of the sudden, everybody in that building, they had to trust every single being, every single soul that we were capable, right? And we were capable because we had no choice but to rise to the moment. And they came up with a system quickly that we did. And so it was just, you're changed by that. And obviously you're changed by so many of the things, all of the, with intake and news, the imagery is on a loop for days and weeks at end and edited. So I think that, kind of you have an imprint in your brain. But professionally, I'll just never forget it. It was such a big moment, a scary moment, and a moment of great responsibility.
Feels as you were telling it, that it was almost like an out-of-body experience.
Yeah. And I'm like, I'm 5'1". I don't even know if they'll really see me, that I should stand up really tall. I'm sure I had on heels.
Heels on top of a desk. Yeah, that's dangerous.
It's dangerous. I wasn't, in hindsight, I thought about that, but not really. But, you've got all these kind of powerhouses in the room and you're, wobbling in your 22-year-old heels. Like, I've got something to bring to the nation.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful lesson. And it's one of those early career moments that I think instilled a level of confidence in me and understanding about what it means to be flexible, what it means to be nimble, and what it means to rise to an occasion in the midst of tragedy.
How do you think about, it feels like there's an era of journalism and reporting that feels like we may never get back to, because now it's in the age of the internet and in the age of how people get their news. That was a defining moment in terms of everyone immediately's first response is to turn on the TV and figure out what's going on. And that's how they felt like they could get the most available news. And I think recent news cycles, when I want to learn something, I go to Twitter.
Yeah.
I checked what's trending on Twitter to figure out what's breaking. So I'm wondering, over the years or decades, in terms of how news has changed, how you've thought of that, how you yourself consume news.
Yeah. And then that prompted a question that I want to ask you. I tend to do a quickly brief at the beginning of the day. I used to do the daily, and then I'll do something as simple as skim, or on Spotify, I'll get my 13-minute news of the day. I had a very hard time with COVID and with other instances with the overconsumption of news, because it made me anxious. It made me stressed.
Oh, yeah.
At times it made me angry, and I don't think I'm an angry person. And what I realized is, I want to know the essentials. I want to be informed, but I also don't want to spend, hours upon hours, because everything you put out there, you have a responsibility for the energy you put into the world. And so if you put something into the world that fuels fear, anxiety, hate, that impacts people, and depending on your following. And so I have become more intentional, more selective about curating my own feeds, if you will. So I tend to turn to newscasts, and I almost say it with insecurity. I'm like, well, a really evolved, wise person would read the Atlantic and, the Wall Street Journal and be able to talk about foreign policy in a way but I just want to be informed without being oversaturated. And news is not really news anymore. There's so much opinion and agenda. And so you have to be pretty careful, I think.
You mentioned you had a question for me.
Okay. So I think a question for you is how you view podcasting. It's obviously if you have a news podcast, but we are in the media landscape. I think you could use, where do you think it fits in the media landscape? I would say an advantage to what you and I are doing is it's not Twitter. And I think YouTube, if somebody watches a video for 5 minutes, you're in the top 0.01% of.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's value in the intimacy of being with someone in their ears on a long drive or walk. But how do you categorize it in the media landscape? Where do you think it fits in?
Depends on the show, but I think what I love so much about it, I started my show in 2014. So at the time,
You were so ahead of the game. 20.
I thought it was late. It's so funny because I was like, oh man, I've waited so long, and I was just a discovering podcast.
Yeah, there was dinosaurs roaming in your backyard, and you had a podcast.
Well, I did just turn 50 last year, so that's been a whole nother self-observation about cycles and yeah,
Life
lots of,
chapters, let's
yeah,
call
life
them.
chapters. But what I realized at the time, Kimmy, is that I was coming from corporates. I worked at I was in corporate for like 20 years. I worked at like JP Morgan Chase and E-Trade in marketing. I tried dabbled in like entrepreneurial stuff. So when I started my show, I was like, I want to learn about podcasting. I used to love Inside the Actor Studio. So
Oh,
I,
so good. Okay.
so
Yes.
James Lipton, R.I.P.
Equally a fan. Yes. Love
But I was
James.
like, I want to do that for podcasting. So I want to tell the story of the people. Like, I want podcasters to sort of like let their hair down and not be the polished on-air like host that everyone hears on their shows, but like figure out like what's going on, why they started the show, and just curiosity. And I did video from day one. I was using Skype with call recorder, so I always wanted the video. And even to this day, I only use the audio. But there's something about having an hour-long face-to-face conversation with someone that you just don't get if it's
Yeah.
just pure audio. And it opened up a whole new world for me because I came from a group like DJing, like vinyl and turntables. Like I literally have like my Technics 1200s in storage somewhere.
So let's just break this down. So you were a banker on Wall Street. You were a DJ with vinyls,
Yeah.
spinning records.
Yes.
And you fell in love with the actor studio and became a podcaster in 1875. It's like,
Yes.
it's fascinating.
It's so funny because I would DJ. I lived in New York City at the time, and I would DJ in like bars on Friday nights. And so the people in the bar, I would tell them I worked at a bank, and they'd be like, "I can't believe you're a banker." And then during the day, I would tell a couple of my friends that I DJ'd, and they'd be like, "I can't believe you're a DJ." Living like two separate lives. It's most fascinating.
I
But
love
DJing
that.
got me into
Yeah.
podcasting because
Yeah.
I created a mobile app, and then apologies to the listener who's heard this 1,000 times, but I created a mobile app to follow the DJs that I liked, and then I thought I was going to interview them. I thought I was going to start a podcast to interview those DJs, but changed my mind, realized how hard that was going to be. Went to a podcasting conference, saw these podcasters speak. I'm like, oh, I want to learn about podcasting. Podcast Junkies came up because that's what I was at the time. I think I had 30 podcasts on my phone. And I was like, wow, this is a fascinating world. So, but to your question, super long-winded roundabout answer. What was fascinating is just getting this peek inside the world of people in a way that was super intimate. And I remember finding shows that I liked early on, listening to the same host week in and week out. And inevitably they would just start revealing tidbits about their life. Like I've done it in my show. Like I had a dog, since passed, a Yorkie. His name was Disco, so listeners would like know about him because I would take him on walks and I would talk about him and just talk about what's going on in my life, talk about all my life changes. And so it's just, you start to get to know. And I would go to a podcasting conference and people would be like, oh, like, how's Disco doing? And I'd be like, I've just met you. Like, literally, like, they would know more about you than you about them,
Yeah.
which I'm sure you've probably experienced as well, which I thought was fascinating. And I just love the fact that there's no gatekeepers. So I can listen to Elon Musk on Joe Rogan just talk for 3 hours, or Edward Snowden or Kanye West. Like I just thought like you can get a peek in someone's head that you can't get from like a 15-minute soundbite, because people, when they're on stage and their performance hat goes on and they feel like they have to like give their polished version of themselves. And so I've just been fascinated by this ability to just, if you ask the right questions. And I know this is a sentiment that you shared because I've heard it on your show, the fact how important stories are and how everyone has a story, and it's the basis for, why you do your show. But I always say that if you go into a bar and there's 50 people there, there's 50 stories there. You just have to ask the right questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
So digging into a little bit, I'm just wondering, you've worked on a couple of different programs. You worked at Good Morning America, Primetime 2020, Oprah Winfrey show. And I know it's hard to pick out specific things or moments, but I'm wondering if there was a consistent thread in terms of like what you were learning at the time and how you were being influenced by some of these personalities, like a Barbara Walters, like a Diane Sawyer, like an Oprah Winfrey, and what from that you've carried through to now.
Yeah. So I think behind the scenes is that an anchor, by virtue of the title, is anchored to the chair wherever they may be. Often in a story that demands the presence of the face of a network, they will. So a field producer is really the person who goes into the field. So we're telling stories about people all around the world. And part of that is, you said at the beginning, your job is to be curious. And that's something Diane Sawyer said to me when I was, jammed up about questions and this. And she just said, lead with your curiosity. Like, lead with your curiosity. So I think what I learned is, you fly, you often do those interviews, you ship back those interviews. And what they often become is sort of the video that plays behind. It sets the stage, and then, the person maybe walks out and there's the live interview. But so it's about creating safe space. You can't have an interview that touches people when they watch it on a television screen. And by the way, a great interview in person that you give a 9 is a 7 on television. There's a certain level of energy when it comes to filming and capturing. So it's a really interesting equation to understand. That begins with a safe space. So my job primarily was talking about people, often about difficult things. If you're not doing a press junket where somebody's like, oh, my movie's coming out, I've, done 35 of these to promote the movie.
Yeah.
But a woman in Tennessee who's sharing her story for the first time. So it's creating the safe space. And that's where you get connection. And that's where they say, I'm sitting across with somebody I trust. I'm sitting across with somebody I feel safe opening up to. It's leading with curiosity. If I was listening at home, what are the questions that I would be asking? Sometimes those are hard questions. Everybody's wondering the thing at home, and you're like, do I really have to say this? Like, is it the uncomfortable thing? Like, your husband was accused of, or, and you're like, oh, I don't want to say this. Like, I'm a good person. And so there's a certain sense of like tapping into that, like finding the strength and realizing that that's a part of arc of it. So I think it's showing up with compassion. I think it's giving time ahead so they feel safe and at ease. It's very intimidating to share your story publicly and have cameras on you. I think it's a lot of listening, less talking, more listening, and just not flying in, I'm going to do an interview, but caring about the person and being present with the person. And that's going to show in spades. One of the hard parts is when you work in those outlets, you then literally FedEx the tape back to New York, and it's out of your control. And one thing that, as I became aware, became very hard for me is I showed up and gave myself, I created the safe space, I created the connection, I really worked as a human being, and now I have no control of how it'll be edited. Because some producer could be like, and tonight's story and a dramatic twist in a Tennessee case. And you're like, was that the intention? Right? Was this like, so that's a complex part of it. But there's so many people who are so good at what they do and so wise and have important conversations that change the way that people think about things. And what I learned at Oprah is, before you pitch any interview, before you begin any interview, before you have any idea, you stop and you ask yourself, what is my intention? And whether that's a product or a podcast or a service, you don't begin it without that. So, and I don't care if it's creating jeans. My intention is, I know women really struggle, and I want them to put on a pair of jeans and just feel a little bit more confident. I want them to walk a room and feel a little more confident. Or my product is a nutritional product, and I know I struggled with, hyperglycemia, whatever it was. And my intention is to make something that was hard easier for me, something that tastes good, that makes people feel a little better. Or my intention in this interview is, I don't think people fully get yet what it means to be transgender, and I want to play my little piece in that. So starting with the intention and then realizing, which we do on the podcast, is that entertain, and this is something that we see in feature film, you can entertain, you can tell a highly engaging, high stakes storytelling, and at the same time, educate and inspire people. And so it doesn't have to be so altruistic, like, we're here to educate you on the new domestic policy, reshaping the way teachers. There is a way to tell an emotional story, that you're sitting on the edge of your seat, where you also walk away informed, inspired, educated. And that was the ethos we went by, which was basically educate, entertain, educate, inspire.
What I love about that is if you're going to do it right, you need to create some space in between you and the moment when you start the interview. It's almost like a meditative, like take a 30-second meditation. Like it feels like the need to sit with that intention and give it enough time to sort of breathe. Because if you check it off, like, okay, I'm checking off what is my intention box, I'm going to rock this interview. It's very different than saying, like, this person has an important story to tell. I have a responsibility and an obligation to create a safe space for them and to tell the story to the best of my abilities. Like, that's completely different in terms of like how you come to an interview, the presence you bring to an interview, and the energy you bring to it as well.
Yeah. And it's like, I always close my eyes and I'm like, how can I fully show up? Like, how can this person feel seen, heard, and how can this be the highest service, right? And often that's listening, but that beginning, as you said, it's like sitting down to a business meeting and somebody pulls out, they're like, all right, well, today on the agenda, as opposed to creating the space of like, I'm not saying chit chat, like, I'm really grateful you guys, have been here. I see the work that you're doing. And so I think the beginning, which most people don't hear in a podcast, is really important. I think the intention is really important. I think the listening is really important. I think tapping into your personal curiosity, and I would extend that to human curiosity. Imagine what your listeners, where are their brains going to be, so you can, deliver something to them that answers their question and informs them.
When did you realize that this is something you wanted to turn into a podcast? When did podcasts come on your radar? And how much time did you spend sitting and preparing for, like in the same way you do for an interview? I imagine you put that same intention and thought into the planning for the podcast. So can you talk a little bit about that process?
Way too much planning. I am working on what is this? Why can't I think of the thing? Analysis paralysis.
Analysis paralysis.
So I think it's a gift that I am such a strategic person. I think that there is a balance to diving in and just showing up, but I like to research. My journalism background, I like to research, I like to understand. So I had produced a movie about my best friend and her husband. We started a production company with two of us, and it was a much bigger lift than one would imagine, but we were lucky. We sold it at Sundance to Amazon, and it took us on this wild, epic journey all around the world to film festivals. But it required a lot of heart and passion and raising money. And, and I looked at my life and I was tired, and I didn't feel like, I felt like I was missing things with my kids, and that all of a sudden my values, I was very proud of the film, but I was like, I just need to take a step back, and I've worked so hard, and just kind of be and figure out what comes to me. And during that time, I started getting up early, which was new for me. And I would listen to a podcast every morning. And I'm just like, I am in love with this. And I realized, well, I've always been behind the camera. I did it for decades. I interviewed people and then I put it in a box and shipped it away. In producing and directing the film, I did the same thing. I did many of the interviews, and I was like, well, what if I shared my voice and captured that creative space and didn't ship it in a box somewhere, but use my editorial instincts and my commitment, spoken and unspoken, to the guest. And there's no barrier to entry. So I came up with the idea. I took a podcasting course called Podcasters Paradise.
I did as well.
Oh my gosh. I got a lot out of it, but the name is kind of funny. And then we did it. And I had friends over in the backyard, And I had my first guest stand up on a stage and tell a story, and he freaking crushed it. Like, I was just like, dude, just drop the mic. You just crush that. And so these are the types of stories we're going to tell. And here's our intention. And like, join us on this ride. You're going to be inspired. You're going to be educated. You're going to be entertained. You're going to learn more about the world. And I want you, as the people I love, and, to be the first people who know about this. So that was like, I don't know what, self-helpy that thing is like when accountability, like when you tell a bunch of people, you're like, oh shit, now I have to do it.
Yeah, public accountability.
So that was, yeah.
How did you think about like the format? How did you think about, getting help? Because you have a producer that helps you with the show. How did you think about planning interviews? I'm just curious how much, because you are preparing, and how far ahead you plan for episodes. Just curious a little bit about what the production looks like.
Yeah. So we often say unthinkable. We tell very high stakes stories, really strong beginning, middle, and an end. And most importantly, actually, what is essential is that there is wisdom extracted on the other end, that people often go through incredibly messy things and find a new meaning, a new perspective on the other end of those things. And so what I like to say is there's a difference between a wound and a scar. So a wound is something that people are in the process of healing for. A scar is something that somebody can look back. An obvious email would be a veteran who would, you see it, and then he, tells the journey of what it meant to. And so we believe that there is wisdom at the other end of those stories. And we also believe that there can be catharticism for finding that and telling them, because it does make meaning of the difficult things. And it can be of great value to our listeners on many levels. And we decided to have a 1-for-1 charitable model, which hadn't been done, that we would share these stories. And for each story, we would make a donation to a charity. And we were going to find 50 stories and 50 charities and make an impact. And, I like to believe the impact of the story is as impactful as the financial contribution, because we can deliver them assets. And nonprofits are really good at policy and creating the work. A lot of times they're not storytellers. And to get a politician on board, to get a donor on board, you have to hook them with an emotional story. So we're like, okay, let's use our skill and bring that over. So finding a story, we've covered crazy things. Solitary confinement, somebody who was wrongfully convicted and spent 10 years in solitary confinement. We just did an episode that was really popular. It was actually on sex trafficking. And the woman that we talked to, when I say the last person that you would ever cast in your mind, this articulate, bright, bubbly mother of four who flipped on our heads sex trafficking in America and what it actually looks like, and how we just did Skylar Baylor, who made history. He was accepted to the women's Harvard swim team, and the year before transitioned and stepped into his truth as a man, and was the first Division I athlete where Harvard said, we will honor your scholarship on the men's team. So we tell a lot of stories that are really dramatic, but each of those people, what they have learned from their experience, and they're all really good at consolidating it. So the process begins with finding great stories. It requires a ton of research, and then we use a metrics, which is how compelling is this story, and it needs to be a 10 out of 10. And then there's a second metrics called the storytelling. How able is this person to deliver their story in an interview? Because people have fabulous stories that you can read about in a magazine. And when you talk to them, they may be a little shy.
Yeah.
And so we want to match those two things so our listeners get the full engagement. So that's the research project. I do that primarily. We do have a virtual assistant. We pour through videos and articles. We do a pre-interview. We make sure it's a good fit. We say, we want to support a charity. tell us who they are. We want to reach out immediately, let them know that this project is happening. I then spend a lot of time researching because that's my background. The interviews are about an hour. Then we get all the audio files. We send them to transcription. Erica, my producer, and I edit the scripts from about an hour and a half to a 40 to 50 minute piece. We send it to a sound engineer. She cleans up any audio and makes it, we want it to sound like, NPR or XM, whatever, wherever you listen. Then it goes to publishing and promoting the episode on social media and writing a newsletter to promote the episode.
How much time goes into each episode?
I will report and get back to you. And my guess is when I do the math, I will pass out and quit the podcast.
What does interview like that do to you energetically?
No one's ever asked me that. That's so good. I am exhausted. I physically am. There was times in the past where I scheduled a call or, I don't know, back when you could meet somebody for coffee and that was acceptable or allowed, I would be like, oh, I have a coffee date after, and I feel emotionally exhausted because you have to be so present and on and focused. And, when I used to work in television and film and we would pitch, pilots or whatever you would do 2 or 3 pitch meetings in a day. And you had to walk in the room and your energy could be nothing less than a 10 to 12. And you would do 3 back to back. And I remember going home and lying on the bed and being like, I can't even, it takes a lot out of you. How about you?
Yeah, it depends on the person telling the story, subject matter. How do you watch to what extent you get emotionally involved in the story or the storyteller?
It's more of a traditional interview. I would say it's 80% traditional interview, meaning I'm mostly listening, but certainly there's some collaboration and conversation. I do know from my background about driving a narrative arc. So sometimes you ask people a question tell me about your childhood, and all of a sudden they're 27. And and so you do have to you're a part of the conversation. And so guiding it, I think there's certain things that we all relate to the things. I don't know if this is selfish or just the human condition, to the things we've been through or the things that are painful or hurt or pain points for us, or things that we can feel so deeply empathetic, I can't just jump to the next question. So if it's something, I have 3 kids and a mother is telling me something that her heart broke in 10 million pieces, it's hard for me to just be like, and then your
next question. Yeah.
Because I just can't, my heart and brain won't let me, right? Yeah, so I just say, as a mother, I can't imagine. I am so sorry. I mean, I'm probably not going to go too far into my own deep story, but I may reference something, I know that, I will reference something if it's very relatable. And the mental health. So I have bipolar disorder. I kept it a secret for 24 years. I was deeply ashamed of it. At the time, there was a big stigma. So I said, I will keep this hidden away with a safe key. And I will cry in the shower and cry in my car and get lots of promotions at my job because they love people who, work 14 hours a day and don't need to sleep that much and have lots of creative ideas. So I made it work, right? But at the same time, I had long stretches of balance, and I have a life and a life that I love. I have a husband and 3 kids, and I've found such joy in this podcasting. But that mental health piece to me, and by the way, sharing that was the best thing ever, which was totally hysterical because I'm okay, I hit it for 24 years. And by now, we had some solid listenership. I'm now I'm just going to throw it up on Instagram. So my ex-boyfriend's going to be that makes a ton of sense. I'm wow, after all these years, just really went for it.
Can you remember the inflection point when you knew that you were going to tell the story?
Well, totally. I mean, I consider myself a aware person. And the irony was like, I was explaining to somebody who doesn't listen to the podcast, and I said, our guests are categorically brave because they share hard truths. They talk about things that are hard with the right intention, which is to be of service to others, right? Because if the cancer survivor never talks about it, and if the person with mental health says, oh, I'm just going to shy this, or the mother who has had with her, pain point or loss with her kid, the whole world feels a little less alone. There's no connection. There's no now somebody reaching out and saying, I found comfort, or gosh, I got guidance or a new idea of what I can do to make this a little easier. So there's disservice in all of that secrecy and fear around having conversations around, hard things. And I was like, so I asked people to talk about their hard truths. I've done that for a long time. I did it for television. Now I'm doing it for a podcast, in some cases with people I know personally. And I'm like, and I have my own total secret. And I just interview people and ask them to talk about hard things, but I don't talk about mine.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how does that work? Like, okay, like, yeah, how does that work? Like, I interviewed, my best friend about, her husband with ALS who lost, was a professional football player and could no longer walk and talk and speak, and how that changes love and romance. And she made us laugh and she made us cry and she was honest. And I'm like, thanks, Michelle. That was really vulnerable. And, listeners learn so much, but don't ask me about my shit. Like, not for me. So I was just kind of like, that was like, I don't think that's who I want to be.
I imagine you found the response was overwhelmingly positive and people really got a lot out of it.
Oh, like totally. Like all the fears of I'll, be judged, or people will be like, oh, I mean, it's almost like narcissistic to think people are going to spend that much time caring. But like, people being like, oh, did you listen to that? Like, she's crazy. Or I don't know, like leaving the PTA meeting and being like, oh, is this one of the ones where she's like, like crying at Safeway? So all those little stories I told myself in my head. But the opposite was parents reaching out early onset, is like in their 20s, and saying like, can you talk to my daughter? Can you talk to me? And I do, it's not everybody's story. This illness has a spectrum and it shows up. It's very serious and needs to be taken seriously. But I could also say to these moms, like, I've had gifts in it. Like, I truly believe that my creativity and productivity is part of the complex chemistry of my brain. And that is worth honoring. And I wish somebody would have said, like, I see your pain and I see your magic, and like, let's understand both. And so it just doesn't have to be this label, this disorder, we'll fix it, there's medication. It's like, let's come up with a toolkit, but let's also celebrate the gifts that comes with her complex mind, and let me be an example that you can live a meaningful life. And, and then like people at the grocery store, like I'm talking about dads in like suits who I've seen 7,000 times, and whatever, they're polite, they're nice, they live in our same town, like hush hush, like in the produce aisle, like next to the heirloom tomatoes. Like, I just want to thank you. When I lived in New York in my 30s, I almost committed suicide. It's something I've never talked to. My wife asked me, and I'm like, kind of like, everyone's hiding a little. Like,
oh yeah,
like everyone. So yeah, that was a really gift. And it was just a gift to me because I spent a lot of time feeling all those shame, guilt feelings, and I don't anymore. And that just frees up more space to fill that headspace with things that can fill the world up, hopefully in more positive ways.
Everyone's hiding a little. I think that's perfectly, like, that's the perfect way to summarize it, because and if you are listening, I know you can relate, and Even the people who admit that they aren't are.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And we did like, some people are hiding and some people can't hide. We did Pablo Escobar's son recently from Buenos Aires in an interview. And for a while, he was able to change his identity for his safety because him and his mother could have been killed. And first of all, he is a lovely human being. He is a man of peace. He has met hundreds, if not thousands, of the family of the victims of his father and had in forgiveness and responsibility, even though he's never had one act of violence in his life. So he was anonymous for many years and just got to be a dad and, a small businessman and a wife husband to his wife. And then Narcos came out and they found him. And so he's back into living and telling this story. So some of us have truths, we all do, that we hide. And some of our guests, their hardest, darkest days are how the world defines them. They can't hide them, And so their perspective and experience is different from those of us who, it wasn't public or, the wounds live on the inside or in the brain.
I feel we need a collective breath there to process that. Because it does, what you just said requires a moment to take it in and like feel into how that sits with you when you hear that and how it affects you and what that means as a listener for you personally, and as a call to really dig into what stories you have that you haven't told that people need to hear.
Oh, me?
No, in general, just like people listening, like, when people hear
really?
this.
I'm like,
I'm just saying, like, when I hear you speak, like, I can't help but just, I'm just ask myself, like, what else can I share? Like, what else needs to be shared? Because it's a reminder of, like, the importance of that.
Yeah. And I think there's also a reminder that nobody owes the world, Brene Brown, I think, says, you share it to the people who've earned the right? And so if you have a public platform, and part of that is I understand the value of in sharing my story. And now I do, that I've done it, and I'm very grateful. But I don't think we should put an expectation on the world that you all have to share the warts and all, have to share your darkest days. Like, vulnerability is very much being celebrated and there's a lot of power in it, but it may be as simple as sharing it with one person. It may be as with your cousin, with your neighbor, now, if you're a podcaster and that's your platform and connecting, then you choose, but I don't think any of us are obligated to share all of our hardest parts and all of our shadows and all of our darkness. But I think if there's the ones that have lessons on the other end, if there's ones, like I said, when I got diagnosed, they said, you'll be on medication for the rest of your life. You're mentally ill. And had they also said to me, and guess what? People with this illness tend to be creatives, tend to be gregarious, tend to you're going to have a little magic with this. This is really exciting, Kimmy. And I would have experienced myself differently. I wouldn't just been like, okay, I'm mentally ill, so I will hide that. I would have been maybe more curious about that piece of myself. So one of my missions now is like, just talk about it in a holistic way, right? Like, because that is the truth, Like, I'm willing to talk about the really hard, dark stuff, but I'm also not going to shy away from the pieces that have allowed me to experience the world very deeply, because I believe there's a gift in that.
What's one preconceived notion that people have about being bipolar?
I think the media, like if you look at Homeland and Carrie, and, I talked about this recently, but she's in a foreign country and she's off her medications and she slept with 17 people and, she's like locked up, that this kind of notion of like crazy, or that maybe it gets, like lumped in. People can relate to depression and anxiety, but you say something like bipolar and maybe people are like, oh, is that more like schizophrenic? Are they having delusions? Are they having, and people are, right? People are committing suicide.
Yeah.
People are, but that doesn't equate to everyone. And there are symptoms, that I have. Rapid speech is one. Your mind becomes unquiet and it's hard to explain to somebody who doesn't experience, but your mind is moving so quickly that, to be honest, it won't stop, and it's exhaustive, but not exhaustive like you're going to fall asleep. It's as if you have adrenaline. You're being shot up with adrenaline. And so people have a tendency to speak quicker, spend more money, sometimes make reckless decisions. People can be over-sexualized. If you look historically, a lot of artists, a lot of entrepreneurs have some form of it. There's less need for sleep. There's less need for food there. And so some of that, like when I did have a manic episode and I was working at a television network, I was a road warrior. And so it was like, we need you to go to this country. And I'm like, sure. And I don't care about the time change. I'll wake up at 3 a.m. for the press conference. And guess what? I felt like I had adrenaline. So I'm like, I'll work a 16-hour days. And by the way, I came up with this creative idea, which may look on my notebook like it was like a little bit, but guess what? It's a really good idea. And by the way, I haven't eaten. So I've lost, 10 pounds, and everyone's like, you look amazing. Dude, you're crushing work. Like, I don't know how you do it. You were in New York and you were here and you were there, and like you pitched that idea. I heard they're doing a 2-part segment. And so if you're not aware, you can almost be like the outside world is like applauding, right? Because those are a lot of, and then if you are aware, you understand that a crash will follow, and a crash is painful, and a crash is isolating, and a crash is the opposite of that. So I have had those experiences in my life, not all of those symptoms, like the spending, the hypersexuality, all of that, like has never been kind of my thing. It's lack of speech, and not lack of the quickening of speech, the rapid thinking, less food, those kind of more those tendencies. So I've had those episodes, but here's the deal. When you are on your medication, when you take care of yourself, when you do all the right things, my life looks pretty darn normal. My brain is pretty active, not pretty. My brain can be exhausting, and it comes with anxiety, but my life, I like my life. I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying is resonating. I've never been formally diagnosed, but some of the symptoms, like the mind that can't shut off, is like the number one thing for me right now. Like literally, like the only time I get a break is when I go to sleep, or I have a glass of wine, or I take an edible.
I can relate. I'm like sleep or wine. Like, yeah, that's.
Well, I feel like I could talk to you for a long time. I appreciate you sharing your story. Just a couple more questions as I wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Oh, what's something I've changed my mind about recently? We moved. We changed our mind about where we want to live and how we want to live. We staying in the same neighborhood. I had a really very ambitious business plan related to the podcast and growing another business. And I looked at my calendar and realized I was going back to that tendency of, and how that's not who I want to be. And I just changed my mind, and I said, I'm going to literally remove that. What is essential? And that was a change of mind, because that's a habit that's been ingrained in me. And I had to call people. I had hired like a publicist to work with for 2 months. And I was like, I don't want to disappoint her. I had hired her. She's a friend. And I just called and said, I need to focus on engaging with my audience and building this digital course with, my best friend, and showing up and leaning into these interviews and loving my family. And I'm going to circle back when this makes sense. And so that's new for me, to let go of the perfectionism and the needing to do it all at once.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
I mean, this is going to sound ridiculous, but I do perceive myself as an intellectual person, but I can't read a book. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, I can't read a book, which I think is just my visual processing or whatever. So everyone's like, gosh, so well read and talking about all these things and like criminal justice. And I'm like, I have to watch videos and go on 3-mile walks and listen to a podcast. Like, oh, I'm going to give you a book. It's, the best novel I've read. I'm like, thank you. I can't read at the beach, but thank you. So yeah, I don't know how to read.
Well, people are, different learning styles, right? Some are kinesthetic, some need to listen to content, some need to watch it, people need to read it, some people need to like write it out before they grasp it. So,
and people think I'm type A, and I have parts of me that are, but I have like a super dirty purse at all times, and I don't feel like that goes with Tay. So I can't read and I have a dirty purse.
Well, Kimi, thank you so much for sharing. I feel like there's a lot of other roads I wanted to go down, but I think I'm really happy with the one we've chosen.
Me too.
I think your story and your podcast is super inspirational. Definitely going to be queuing it up to binge on several episodes. I think I make a more conscious effort just to go back and really, really listen to the podcast that I enjoy at 1x, which is really rare for me because normally what I do is everything is 2x. And so I recently deleted over 100 podcasts from my podcast player. And I think I'm just trying to be more intentional. So it's no surprise that our paths are crossing at this time, because that's the way the universe rolls, I think. So,
and I love a good podcast declutter. I'll send you an email with some of my favorites that I think you'll like. So I'll shoot you an email today.
Okay. So we'll make sure we have links to the podcast in the show notes. Any other places people can connect with you online?
Sure. We're on Instagram at All the Wiser Podcasts, on Facebook at All the Wiser Podcast, and Twitter at All the Wiser Pod. And you can follow me at Kimi Culp on Instagram.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Take care, Harry.
Thanks again to Kimi for coming on the show. Always appreciated. Special thanks to my good friend Shelby Stanger for making the introduction. I'm so happy she did. What a fun conversation. Full show notes are available at podcastjunkies.com/257. And that includes the links I mentioned at the top of the show, links to our Clubhouse room, my Clubhouse profile, and the bunches.chat app that I'm testing out for community engagement. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Scarlett 2x2 Pro. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/chat15. Tune in next week for my conversation with Tarika Johnson, host of Blackpacking. That was a connection made through the Podcast Academy. And I'm really glad we got to connect. Fun conversation, especially when you talk about all things travel, which is really a passion of mine. If you made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with TV Kimi. That's TVKIMI. And you can tag Kimi at All the Wiser Pod, one word, and podcast_junkies. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Have a fantastic week.